Despite several legal measures being proposed in Washington, there is still growing urgency for fundamental police reform nationwide. In fact, some of the country's biggest cities have already made sweeping changes to their police forces. Let's bring in Ed Chung now. He is the Vice President of Criminal Justice Reform at the Center for American Progress. Hi, Ed. Welcome. Great to have you with us. You have a plethora of experience working on police reform. During your tenure at the Justice Department, you worked closely with the Obama administration and helped create a national initiative for building trust between the justice system and the communities that system serves. So how do you believe we now repair the broken relationship between communities of color and police?
Thanks for having me. And I think one of the big things to emphasize here is what Senator Harris talked about, which is accountability. When you see that law enforcement officers aren't held accountable, but not only officers, departments aren't held accountable for the systemic change that they have failed to implement, then that lowers the trust that the community has in law enforcement and in the systems of justice. So when we're talking about either the Trump executive order or Senator Scott's bill that is devoid of meaningful reforms and meaningful accountability, that's where it falls flat. You need to have accountability from our systems of government, and often police departments are the face of government to a lot of communities. So without accountability, there really is no police reform.
And Ed, as you know, there are many people across the country right now calling for defunding of police departments. You actually led an interagency effort to reduce the use of military equipment by law enforcement, which I know is a slightly separate issue. But I'm curious what your take is on defunding the police. Do you believe that is the best option going forward?
Well, whenever you talk about defunding the police, you have to first talk about where government has already defunded things, especially in Black and brown communities. You have to start with talking about where the government has defunded education or defunded social services, all of these other things that were conscious decisions, often in the name of fiscal austerity. And so when there is a hole in communities that government has already defunded, the one place that hasn't been defunded is policing, and police will take up that vacuum. So instead of talking about defunding the police, I think one of the things that we have to consider is where have we as a society, where have we as communities divested from, and where have we invested in? And in too many places, we've only invested in law enforcement as a solution, and that can't happen.
So you're saying the money comes from one pot and it has to be divvied up from that one pot, and we need to rethink the way we're divvying it up. Is that correct?
Well, in a lot of, if you especially look at state and local governments, it's different than in the federal government. State and local governments, there's a
right. That's what I'm talking about. The local level. They they have limited funds, correct?
Right, and so you have to look at, first of all, how much of the policing budget takes up a city's budget. And it differs in different cities and in different localities, but especially if you are not funding these other areas, but also keeping funding levels for police at very high levels, you really have to take a look at that and see where your priorities are as a city.
Now, Ed, President Trump signed an executive order Tuesday to address excessive force used by police departments. And among other things, this order creates a database to track officers with excessive force complaints. Was it a wise move for the president to include that provision? And do you believe the executive order as a whole is a good step toward progress?
Well, I think both the executive order and, unfortunately, Senator Scott's bill is from the same cloth. It says a lot of good things and addresses it tries to address things and issue areas, but it doesn't do so in a meaningful way. Again, both Senator Scott's bill and the executive order do not have any meaningful accountability measures in there at all. And you'll see that through their talking points as well. You'll see statements like incentivize or encourage or best practices or trainings, but you won't see something like hold officers accountable. And that's what you do see in
So, Ed, you have said reforming the police requires systemic change, which you say begins with withholding officers and departments accountable for their failures, misconduct, violations of law. If you were directly advising the president or lawmakers on Capitol Hill, how would you suggest we do that going forward? In other words, how would you suggest that executive order we just discussed, Senator Scott's bill we just discussed, to give it some teeth? How do you give it teeth?
Well, the first thing that the administration do is you don't need an executive order to do. The Department of Justice under former Attorney General Sessions and current Attorney General Barr refused to take up their statutory authority and duty to investigate police departments for patterns and practices of misconduct and unconstitutional policing. You don't need an executive authority to do that. There is already a statute to do that. Yet this current Department of Justice has failed to push that forward. So increasing those types of activities are things that the administration can already do, as well as other things that are proposed in the Justice and Policing Act that is being considered by the House. So really, this Department of Justice has not only rolled back, as you said earlier, a lot of the reforms that were instituted in the previous administration, but then even took that a step further, and they were abdicating their statutory responsibility to investigate police departments.
All right. Well, Ed Chung from the Center for American Progress, we really appreciate you being with us. Thanks so much for your time.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much.